Rebecca Hartley pressed the debt notice flat against the table and did not cry. She had promised herself that much. No more tears. Her father's cough rattled through the thin cabin wall like stones in a tin can, and she felt the sound in her chest, the way a woman feels something breaking. 23 years old, and this was her life. A dying man, a stolen future, and a stranger's name on a piece of paper. She picked up the pen, and she signed. If this story moves you, subscribe, follow it all the way to the end, and drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far Rebecca's story travels. The morning Caleb Walker rode into Harlow Creek, nobody paid him much attention. That was the thing about men like Caleb Walker. They didn't announce themselves. No silver spurs catching the light, no hat tilted at a dramatic angle, no speech prepared for the crowd. He came in on a brown quarter horse, with muddy fetlocks and a bedroll strapped behind the saddle, and he tied the animal at the post outside the general store with the kind of quiet efficiency that said he had done this 10,000 times before and expected nothing remarkable to follow. He wasn't young, not old either, somewhere in that middle stretch of a man's life, where the hardness of the years shows in his jaw and his hands, but hasn't yet reached his eyes. His eyes, when he finally pushed through the door of Whitmore's general store, were the color of a mountain sky an hour before a storm, gray and watchful, and very still. May Whitmore looked up from behind the counter and made her assessment in under 3 seconds, the way a woman in a small town learns to do. "Help you with something?" "Looking for the Hartley place," Caleb said. He set both hands flat on the counter. "Thomas Hartley. He's still out on the Foothills Road?" May's expression shifted just enough. "Thomas Hartley's been laid up going on 4 months now. His daughter runs the place. Why you asking?" "Old business." He didn't offer more than that. May studied him for another beat. "You a creditor?" "No, ma'am." "Because that family's had enough of those." She said it like a warning, not an answer. "Rebecca Hartley is a good girl. She don't deserve more trouble coming at her door." Caleb picked his hat up off the counter. "I don't intend to bring trouble," he said simply. "I intend to offer a solution." He was gone before May could decide whether that was reassuring or the most alarming thing she'd heard all week. Rebecca was in the garden when she heard the horse. Not much of a garden anymore. The summer heat had hit the Colorado foothills harder than usual, and what little she'd managed to coax out of the cracked dirt looked thin and sorry. Beans, mostly. A few squash. She had her sleeves rolled to the elbows and her hair pinned back in a way that had been neat at 6 in the morning and was decidedly less so now. And she was on her knees in the dirt because that was where the work was. She stood when she heard the horse. She wiped her hands on her apron and she shaded her eyes against the white summer glare, and she watched a stranger ride up the path toward the cabin. She didn't reach for the rifle. Not yet. She watched him dismount, tie his horse to the fence post with easy hands, and walk toward her without hurry. When he was close enough that she could make out his face, she said, "This is private property." "Yes, ma'am." He stopped at a respectful distance. "Rebecca Hartley?" "Who's asking?" "Caleb Walker." He held out one hand. She didn't take it. He let it fall back to his side without offense. "I knew your daddy some years back. We worked the same claim up on the Gunnison before he moved south." Rebecca looked at him very carefully. "My father never mentioned a Caleb Walker." "No reason he would have. We weren't close. But I heard he was unwell, and I heard about the situation with the debt, and I—" He stopped, seemed to recalibrate whatever he'd been planning to say. "I'd like to speak with you, Miss Hartley, if you're willing." "About what?" He met her eyes. about a proposition. The word landed between them like a stone dropped into still water, and Rebecca felt every ripple of it. She had heard that word before, heard it from men who smelled like tobacco and good intentions, and wanted something they weren't prepared to say plainly. She pulled herself up to her full height, which was not inconsiderable, and she looked at Caleb Walker with the particular expression her mother had left her in lieu of anything more practical. "Mr. Walker," she said, "I'm going to ask you something, and I want you to answer me straight. I'll do my best. What kind of proposition?" He didn't flinch. He didn't look away. "Marriage," he said. She didn't throw him off the property. That surprised them both, she thought. What she did was stand very still for a moment that stretched longer than it should have, and then she said, "Come inside," in the flat tone of a woman who had run out of the energy required for dramatics. She turned and walked toward the cabin without looking back to see if he followed. He followed. Her father was in the back room, asleep in the chair by the small window. She could hear his breathing from the doorway, shallow and labored, and nothing like the breathing of the man who had once carried her on his shoulders, clear across a summer meadow. She stood in the doorway for just a moment, then turned back to the main room where Caleb Walker had seated himself on the bench near the door. Not at the table, she noticed. He'd left that for her. She poured 2 cups of water from the pitcher and set one in front of him, and sat across the table and looked at him directly. "Talk," she said. Caleb leaned forward with his forearms on his knees and held the cup in both hands and looked at the floor for a moment before he looked up at her. "I'm 41 years old," he said. "I've spent the last 20 years working the high country. I've got a place up in the mountains, solid structure, good land, water that don't run dry. But it's a hard life, remote. I need a wife who's capable, not one who's going to fall apart the first hard winter." "And you looked at my situation and thought I seemed desperate enough to agree." He didn't deny it. She respected that, marginally. "I thought you seemed capable," he said. "There's a difference." "Is there?" It wasn't a question. "Miss Hartley," he set the cup down. "I know how this sounds. I'm not a foolish man. I know exactly how it sounds. But I'm also not a man who's going to dress it up in language it don't deserve. Your father owes $340 to Aldridge & Sons. They've already filed the paperwork to seize this property. You've got maybe 3 weeks before they act on it." Her jaw tightened. "How do you know the exact figure?" "I asked around." He said it without apology. "I wanted to understand the situation before I came to you, because what I'm offering would clear that debt, all of it. And your father could stay here. This property would be paid free and clear in his name. You'd come north with me, and I'd treat you with respect. That's my word." Rebecca was quiet for a very long time. Outside, a meadowlark called once and went silent. "Why?" she finally said. "You don't know me. Why would you do this?" Something moved across his face. Not discomfort exactly. More like a man choosing how much of the truth to tell at once. "I told you, I need someone capable." "That's not the whole answer." He looked at her for a long moment. "No," he said quietly. "It ain't." She waited. "I came back through this country because I had business to settle," he said. "Old business. And when I heard about Thomas Hartley's daughter, heard how she'd kept this place going, kept her father fed and doctored on nothing, I thought about the kind of woman that takes." He paused. "I've been alone a long time, Miss Hartley. That's the rest of the answer." She sent him away without a decision. She needed 3 days, she said, and she said it like it wasn't negotiable, and he accepted that without argument. He gave her the name of the hotel in town where he'd be staying, tipped his hat in the doorway, and walked back out to his horse, the same unhurried way he'd arrived. Rebecca stood at the window and watched him ride back down the road, and she pressed one hand flat against the glass, and she let herself be honest for exactly 30 seconds. The kind of honesty that only happens when nobody is watching. She was terrified. Not of him specifically. He hadn't frightened her in the direct animal way that some men could frighten a woman. What terrified her was how reasonable it had sounded. How plainly and practically he had laid it out, and how her mind had immediately begun to do the arithmetic, and how the arithmetic kept coming up the same way. $340. 3 weeks. A property in her father's name, free and clear. She pressed her forehead against the cool glass and closed her eyes. "Becca?" Her father's voice from the back room was thin and papery. She straightened, smoothed her apron, and walked back to where he sat, tilted in his chair, with his eyes half open. "Who was that?" he said. "Nobody, Papa. You rest." "I heard a horse." "Neighbor's boy," she said, "checking on us. Sleep." He subsided into the chair with a sound that broke her heart clean in two. His hands were so thin now, the hands that had held hers crossing every rocky creek of her childhood. She sat on the footstool beside him and took one of those hands in both of hers and looked at the lines and calluses of it like she was memorizing something. She had known, somewhere underneath all the practical busyness of the last 4 months, that this wasn't sustainable. She had known it and refused to let herself look at it straight. There was no money left. There would be no money coming. And 3 weeks from now, Aldridge and Sons would take the only home her father had ever truly owned, and he would die. Not of the illness, but of that. She believed that completely. She pressed his hand to her cheek and stayed very still for a long time. The next morning she walked to town. She did it early, before the heat settled in, and she went to the one person in Harlow Creek she trusted to tell her the truth without dressing it in kindness. Ida Pruitt was 63 years old, and had been widowed twice, and had survived things that polite company didn't name at dinner tables. And she kept a small dry goods shop on the east side of the main street that smelled of cedar and lye soap, and something underneath both of those things that Rebecca had always associated with fortitude. "I need to ask you something private," Rebecca said, and she closed the door behind her. Ida looked up from the bolt of cloth she was measuring. "Sit down, girl. You've got that look." "What look?" "The look of a woman who's made up her mind and come to find permission." She set the cloth aside. "Sit." Rebecca sat. She laid the whole thing out. Caleb Walker, the proposition, the money, the mountain place. She told it plainly, the way he had told it plainly, because she found she didn't have the energy for anything else. When she finished, Ida was quiet for a long moment. "You know anything about this man?" she said finally. "Very little." "You trust him?" Rebecca thought about that. About the way he'd sat at the bench near the door instead of the table. About the way he'd let his hand fall when she didn't take it. About the way he'd said, "I've been alone a long time," and meant it to be heard. "I think he's honest," she said carefully. "That's not the same as knowing him." "No," Ida agreed. "It ain't." She laced her fingers together on the counter. "Rebecca, what is it you're really asking me?" Rebecca looked down at her hands. "I'm asking you if I'm a fool for considering it." "You'd be a fool for not." Ida said it without hesitation. "That's the truth of it. I don't like it, because you deserve better than a business arrangement with a stranger. But you don't have better on offer right now. What you have is a dying father and a debt and a man who's willing to deal fairly." She paused. "Is he decent? Does your gut tell you he's decent?" Rebecca thought about those gray, watchful eyes. The way they'd stayed steady when she'd pushed back at him. The way he hadn't offered her pretty words. "Yes," she said quietly. My gut says he's decent. Then you already know what you're going to do. She told him on the third day, as she had said she would. She walked to the hotel in the late afternoon, when the worst of the heat had begun to ease, and she asked for him at the front desk, with her back straight and her voice level. And when he came down the stairs and saw her standing there, something shifted briefly in his expression. Something that might have been relief, but passed too quickly for her to name it. They stood in the small lobby, neither of them wanting the audience of the front desk boy, and Rebecca said without preamble, "I have conditions." Caleb almost smiled. It didn't quite make it to his face, but she saw it trying. "That's fair," he said. "My father keeps the property in his name, free and clear. You pay the debt before we leave." "Agreed. I'll cook and I'll work, but I'm not your servant. I'm your wife or I'm nothing. Those are the only two terms." "Agreed. And if this arrangement becomes something I cannot bear, I want your word that you won't stand in my way." That one stopped him. He looked at her for a long moment with those steady gray eyes, and she felt the weight of it. Not threat exactly, but the seriousness of a man who understood that some promises cost more than others. "You have my word," he said finally. "But I'd ask the same of you. If it becomes something you cannot bear, you tell me straight. You don't run. You tell me." She considered that. "Fair enough. Then I reckon we have a deal." He held out his hand. This time she took it. His grip was firm and dry, and said nothing it wasn't supposed to say. She shook it once and let go, and she thought, "I have just changed the entire shape of my life in 30 seconds. And the thought was so enormous that she couldn't feel it properly yet, could only stand there in the lobby of a hotel in Harlow Creek, Colorado, on a Tuesday afternoon in July of 1885, and understand that something had ended and something else had begun. They were married 4 days later at the county office. No guests. Her father was too ill to attend, and she hadn't told anyone who might have tried to talk her out of it. The justice of the peace was a small man who read the words in a tone that suggested he'd read them approximately 10,000 times, and Caleb stood beside her in a clean shirt and said what he was supposed to say in his quiet, level voice. And Rebecca said what she was supposed to say and kept her eyes forward and did not cry. She had promised herself that much. Afterward, Caleb paid the debt at the Aldridge office personally, in cash, and Rebecca watched the transaction from the doorway with her arms folded and her face carefully neutral. She watched Aldridge's clerk count the bills with that particular expression of a man whose leverage had just been removed, and she felt something tight in her chest begin, very slightly, to loosen. It was done. She went home to her father and sat with him through the evening and told him about the arrangement in terms he could hear without being frightened. She told him the property was his. She told him that she would send money when she could. She told him that she had married a good man, a capable man, and that she would be fine. Her father looked at her for a long time with those faded eyes that had once been so like her own, and he said, "Are you telling me the truth, Becca? Or are you telling me what I need to hear?" She had to think about that for a moment. "Both," she said finally. "I think both of those things are true right now." He seemed to accept that. He squeezed her hand once, weakly, and she stayed until he was asleep. And then she walked out to the front porch and sat in the dark for a long time, listening to the summer crickets and the distant sound of the creek. And she let herself feel everything she hadn't felt in the lobby or the county office or the Aldridge building. The fear, the grief of leaving, the strange, tentative thing underneath both of those. Something that was not quite hope, but was at least in that general direction. She was Mrs. Caleb Walker now. She was leaving for the high country in the morning. She knew almost nothing about the man she had married, and the man she had married had told her, plainly and without apology, that he had not told her everything. She pressed her feet flat against the porch boards and looked up at the summer stars and thought, "All right then. All right." She would find out what there was to find out. She would handle whatever needed handling. She had been doing exactly that for 23 years, and she did not intend to stop now. When Caleb Walker came riding up the road at first light the next morning, with a spare horse saddled and ready, Rebecca was already standing on the porch with her bag packed. She didn't look back at the cabin as they rode away. She had said her goodbyes in the dark the night before. She looked ahead, at the mountains rising blue and enormous against the morning sky, and she thought about a man who kept his own counsel, who paid his debts in cash, who had sat at the bench near the door instead of the table. She thought, "Who are you, Caleb Walker?" And she thought, "I suppose I'm going to find out." The first hour of riding, they didn't speak. Rebecca hadn't expected conversation exactly, but the silence had a texture to it she hadn't anticipated. Not cold, not uncomfortable. Just the kind of quiet that belonged to a man who didn't feel the need to fill space with noise. She watched the foothills give way to steeper terrain, felt the air shift and cool as the trail climbed, and kept her eyes ahead because looking back was a choice she'd already made not to make. Caleb rode at an easy pace, a half length ahead of her, and she noticed the way he held himself in the saddle. Loose-shouldered, unhurried, like a man who had made this particular peace with the land a long time ago and no longer had to negotiate it. His horse knew the way, or seemed to. They turned off the main road onto a trail that most people would have ridden right past, and the trees closed in on both sides, and the sound of Harlow Creek and everything it contained began to fall away behind them. "How far?" she finally asked. He glanced back. 2 days, maybe a shade less if the creek crossing's good. "We're camping." "Yes, ma'am." She had known that. She'd packed accordingly. She didn't know why the confirmation felt like it landed differently when he said it. Maybe because it meant 2 days of this particular silence. 2 days of working out exactly what they were to each other in the practical, moment-to-moment sense, before they arrived at whatever waited at the end of this trail. "Tell me about the place," she said. He was quiet for a beat. "What do you want to know?" "Whatever you'd tell a person who's about to live there." He seemed to consider that seriously. "It's high," he said. "Higher than you're used to. The winters are hard, not violent hard, but long. You won't see much of the outside world between November and March most years." "And the summers?" "Like nothing you've ever seen." He said it simply, not as a sales pitch, and that was precisely why it landed. Rebecca looked at the back of his shoulders and thought about the word nothing. She had been nowhere, she realized. 23 years, and the farthest she'd traveled from her father's cabin was the county seat 20 miles east. Whatever was waiting for her at the end of this trail, it was further from that cabin than distance could measure. "You said you had business in the area," she said. "Old business. What kind?" He didn't answer right away. The trail narrowed around a bend, and he guided his horse through it before he spoke. "The kind that's finished now," he said. She knew when a door was being closed. She didn't push it, not yet. But she cataloged it the way she cataloged everything, carefully, without reaction, for later examination. They made camp that first night beside a shallow run of water that moved quick and cold over pale stones. Caleb built the fire with the same economical efficiency he seemed to bring to everything, and Rebecca made coffee and fried the salt pork she'd packed without being asked. And they sat on opposite sides of the fire and ate without ceremony. It was Caleb who broke the silence this time. You said your conditions back in that hotel lobby like a woman who'd been practicing them, he said. Rebecca looked up. I had been. All three of them? The third one surprised me when it came out, she admitted. But I meant it. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile. Not quite not. You meant every word you said, didn't you? Not performance. You meant it. Why would I perform? I had nothing to gain from it. He nodded slowly. No, he said. I reckon you didn't. He turned his cup in both hands. I want you to know. I meant every word I said, too. The terms I offered you are the terms I intend to keep. I believe that, she said, and found that she did. You believed it fast. I'm a good judge of what a man means and what he doesn't. She met his eyes across the fire. My father was a man who meant almost everything he said and followed through on almost none of it. I learned young to tell the difference. The firelight moved across Caleb's face, and he looked at her with that steady, considering gaze she was beginning to recognize as his default mode of attention. That's a hard thing to learn, young, he said. Most useful things are. He was quiet for a moment. Then, what was he like? Before he was sick. Rebecca thought about it honestly, which meant sitting with all of it. The man who'd carried her on his shoulders, and the man who'd chased gold claims, and the man who'd borrowed more than he could ever repay, because he always believed the next thing would be the thing that changed everything. He was wonderful, she said. And he was reckless. Both at the same time, all the time. He loved big and gambled big and lost big, and he never once seemed to understand that other people paid the cost of it. She paused. I loved him completely. Still do. That's the complicated part. Caleb said nothing, but he didn't look away, and that, the simple act of a man letting her say a hard thing without trying to fix it or minimize it, unlocked something in her chest she hadn't expected. He's going to die before spring, she said. I know it. He knows it. We just don't say it. I'm sorry. Don't be sorry. Be glad he's dying in his own house, with the debt cleared. She said it harder than she meant to. Then, that's why I said yes. I want you to know that. Not because I was desperate in the way people mean when they say desperate. Because of him. Because he deserved to die where he lived. Caleb held her gaze across the fire. I know, he said quietly. She stared at him. You knew that was why. I suspected. And you came anyway. Yes. He set his cup down. I came anyway. The fire crackled between them, and somewhere in the dark above the trees, a nightbird called once and went still. And Rebecca thought, this is the strangest situation I have ever been in. And underneath that thought, small and tentative as a seedling, but I am not afraid. She wasn't sure what to do with that. She filed it away with everything else and went to sleep. The second day, the trail got harder. It climbed steadily, switchbacking up terrain that grew rockier and steeper with every hour. And by mid-morning, Rebecca's thighs were burning, and her horse was working hard, and she had stopped pretending to be comfortable. She didn't complain. She'd decided early on that complaining wasn't something she was going to do. But at a wide place in the trail where Caleb pulled up to rest the horses, she dismounted and stretched her back with her hands on her hips and made a sound she hadn't planned on making. Caleb glanced at her. First time riding this distance? First time riding more than 6 miles. She said it plainly, without apology. He looked at her for a moment. You should have said. What would you have done differently? Slower pace, more stops. We'd have needed 3 days instead of 2. That would have been fine. She looked at him steadily. I don't need managing, Mr. Walker. I didn't say you did. He handed her the canteen. I said I'd have adjusted the pace. That ain't management. That's just common sense. He paused. And you can stop calling me Mr. Walker. Caleb, then. That'll do. She drank from the canteen and handed it back and looked up at the peaks ahead. Closer now. Enormous, blue-white where the snow still clung to the highest reaches, even in July. And she had the sudden, very clear sensation of being genuinely small. Not diminished. Small the way a person is small inside something vast, which is different. It was not an unpleasant feeling, she found. It was almost a relief. Caleb. He looked up from checking the girth strap. Thank you, she said, for adjusting the pace. He nodded once. They mounted and rode on. It was late afternoon on the second day when he stopped without warning. Not a gradual slowing, a full stop, both hands coming up, his horse going still underneath him, with an obedience that told her the animal knew this signal and respected it absolutely. Rebecca pulled up beside him and opened her mouth to ask, and then she heard it. Horses. More than one, coming down the trail fast. Caleb's whole posture had changed. Not tense exactly, but gathered, the way a man gathers himself when he's expecting something he'd hoped not to encounter. He moved his horse slightly forward and to the left, which put him between Rebecca and the bend in the trail. And he did it so naturally, she almost didn't notice. Almost. 3 riders came around the bend. They pulled up sharp when they saw Caleb, and the man in front, broad across the chest, hat pushed back, the kind of face that had learned early it could take up whatever room it wanted, looked from Caleb to Rebecca and back with an expression that rearranged itself from surprise to something uglier. Walker, he said. Denton. Caleb's voice was exactly as level as it always was. Not warm, not cold. Level. Didn't expect to see you on this side of the ridge. Didn't expect to see you at all. Denton's eyes had settled on Rebecca with an attention she didn't like. Who's the woman? My wife. The word landed so simply, so completely without either apology or display, that Rebecca felt something shift in her spine. She hadn't heard him say it before. She had called herself Mrs. Walker, had thought it in her own head, but hearing it in his voice, matter-of-fact and immovable, was entirely different. Denton looked openly skeptical. Your wife. He said it like the words didn't fit together correctly. When'd that happen? 4 days ago. Huh. Denton let that sit a moment. His eyes moved back to Rebecca with the particular kind of assessment she had been navigating since she was 16 years old. Ma'am, he said, with a tilt of his head that was technically polite and actually the opposite. Rebecca said nothing. She held his gaze exactly long enough to let him know she'd categorized him, then looked away with the deliberate disinterest of a woman who has bigger things to think about. Something twitched at Caleb's mouth. You need something, Denton? He said. Or are you just passing through? Thought I might ride up to the valley. Denton's voice shifted slightly. Something casual forced over something that wasn't. You know, see how things are sitting. Things are sitting fine, Caleb said. You can head back down. The 2 men looked at each other, and Rebecca watched the weight of something large and unspoken move between them like weather. She didn't know the story. She could feel it, though. Years of it, layered and complicated and not finished. You know Hargrove's been asking questions, Denton said finally. Caleb didn't move. I know. He's not the kind of man who stops asking. I know that too. Denton looked at him for another long moment. Then he shifted his gaze briefly to Rebecca, something that was almost, but not quite, a warning, and touched the brim of his hat. Safe travels, he said, and turned his horse and rode back the way he'd come, his 2 companions falling in behind him without a word. The sound of hooves faded. Rebecca waited until they were gone before she said anything. Who is Hargrove? Caleb was quiet for a moment. His eyes were still on the bend in the trail. "Old business," he said. She stared at him. "You said that yesterday." "I know."
"Caleb," she kept her voice steady, "who is Hargrove? And why did that man just look at me like I was standing in a place I didn't know was dangerous?"
He turned and looked at her then. Really looked at her. Not the measured, considering glance he usually offered, but something more direct, more unsettled. It lasted only a moment, and then his expression settled back into its customary stillness. "There are some things I need to tell you," he said. "About the valley. About my situation." "Yes," she said. "There are." "I'll tell you when we arrive, when you can see the whole picture and understand it properly." He met her eyes. "I'm not hiding it from you to deceive you. I'm waiting until I can explain it fully. There's a difference." She looked at him for a long moment and made her assessment and made her decision. "You have until we get there," she said. "After that, I ask and you answer. All of it." Agreed. They rode on. The light was going golden and long when the trail crested the last ridge and Caleb said, "Look up." She did, and the valley opened before her. She had expected many things. She had imagined a cabin, perhaps larger than her father's, perhaps better built, but a cabin nonetheless. She had imagined a clearing, some pasture, a vegetable garden, the basic bones of a working homestead. She had not imagined this. The structure that stood at the center of the valley was not a cabin. It was not a farmhouse. It was not anything she had a ready word for in the vocabulary of a girl from a Colorado foothills cabin. And it was enormous. And it was real. And the mountain air was rushing past her face, and she could not find her breath. "Caleb." Her voice came out very quiet. "I know," he said. "You told me you had a place." "I do." "That is not a place." She turned and looked at him. His expression was carefully, deliberately neutral, the expression of a man waiting to see what happened next. "What is that?" He held her gaze. "That," he said, "is the winter house. And it's been in my family for 31 years. And there are some things about my family, Rebecca, that I have not told you." The valley stretched out below them, impossibly green in the last of the summer light, and the structure at its heart stood solid and vast and silent. And Rebecca Hartley Walker felt the ground she thought she was standing on shift completely beneath her feet. "Get down off the horse," she said, very evenly. He dismounted. She dismounted. She stood in the trail with her hands at her sides, and she looked at him with the full attention of a woman who is done being patient. "Start," she said, "from the beginning." He didn't look away from her. That was the first thing she noticed. Most men, when cornered by a woman's directness, found something else to look at. Caleb Walker looked straight at her and said, "My full name is Caleb James Walker Hargrove." The silence that followed was the loudest thing Rebecca had ever heard. "Hargrove," she repeated. "My mother's name was Walker. She left the Hargrove family when I was 9 years old, and she took me with her, and she went back to her maiden name and never looked back. I did the same." He paused. "Edmund Hargrove is my father's brother. My uncle." Rebecca stared at him. The golden light was still falling across the valley below them, indifferent to the fact that her understanding of everything had just rearranged itself completely. "The man Denton mentioned," she said carefully. "The man who's been asking questions." "Yes." "He's your family." "He is." Something hardened in Caleb's jaw. Family in the biological sense of the word, not in any other. She crossed her arms. "And this property?" "My father built it. Daniel Hargrove. He broke from Edmund's operation 31 years ago and came up here and built something clean." His voice was level, but carrying something underneath it. Old grief, long compressed. "He died 8 years ago, left everything to me. Legal, documented, signed, and witnessed 3 times over." "And Edmund wants it." "Edmund has always wanted it." Caleb met her eyes. "The valley sits on top of the richest silver vein in this part of Colorado. My father knew it and chose not to mine it. He said the land deserved better than to be gutted for profit. Edmund has spent the better part of a decade trying to find a legal angle to contest the inheritance." Rebecca was quiet for a moment. The pieces were moving into place, and she didn't like the picture they were forming. "Denton works for Edmund," she said. "He does." "So when he came up that trail this afternoon—" "He was checking whether I was back, whether the property was occupied." Caleb's voice went very quiet. "An unoccupied property is a vulnerability. Edmund's lawyers have been arguing I've abandoned it." Rebecca felt something cold move through her, despite the summer warmth. "And a married man with a wife setting up a proper household is considerably harder to claim abandonment against." He held her gaze steadily. "Yes." The word landed, and she let it land, and she stood in it for a long moment. "So part of why you needed a wife," she said slowly, "was legal protection for this property." "Yes." One word, quiet and undefended. She nodded once, not agreement, just receipt. Her mind was moving fast, and she needed it to move faster. "Why didn't you tell me this before the wedding?" "Because I needed to know you'd chosen me." He said it without drama, which made it worse, somehow, than if he'd said it with any. "If I had told you about the silver and the property and the legal fight, I couldn't have known whether you were saying yes to the situation or to the arrangement between us. I needed the arrangement to be clean." "That," Rebecca said with great precision, "was not your decision to make on my behalf." "No," he said, "it wasn't. And I'm not asking you to excuse it. I'm asking you to understand it." She stared at him for 3 full seconds. Then she turned and walked 10 paces down the trail, away from him, and stood with her back to him and her hands pressed together in front of her mouth, breathing deliberately through her nose. He didn't follow. He waited. That, the waiting, the not crowding her, was the only reason she didn't get back on the horse and ride straight back down to Harlow Creek. She turned around. "Here is what I need you to understand," she said. Her voice was controlled and very clear. "I made a decision about my life. I made it with incomplete information because you chose to give me incomplete information. That is a harm, Caleb, whether you meant it as one or not." "I know it," he said, "and I need you to understand that if you keep things from me again, if there is one more thing I find out sideways, rather than from your mouth directly, we will have a problem that no amount of good intentions will fix." "Understood. Is there anything else?" He paused. It was a short pause, barely a breath, but she caught it. "Is there anything else," she repeated, "that I need to know, right now, before we walk down to that house?" He exhaled. "Hargrove has a man in Harlow Creek, has had one for 2 years, which means he knows I went to town. He knows I came back with a wife." He paused again. "He'll move faster now. Whatever legal action he's been preparing, he'll push it forward." "How much time do we have?" "I don't know. Weeks, possibly. Less if he's further along than I know." Rebecca looked down at the valley, at the structure that had stopped her breath 20 minutes ago, and she thought about her father in his chair by the window, and the debt notice she had pressed flat with her palm, and the pen she had picked up. and the life she had agreed to without knowing its full shape. She thought, I am so tired of men making decisions about what I can and cannot handle. And then she thought, with the particular clarity that sometimes follows exhaustion, but I am here, and that house is still standing, and I am not the kind of woman who turns around. All right, she said. Caleb blinked. All right? We deal with it. She picked up her reins. Tell me the rest on the way down. All of it this time. He did. By the time they reached the valley floor, she knew the full shape of the Hargrove situation. The contested will, the silver surveys Edmund had commissioned illegally, the 2 attempts to bribe the county recorder, the lawyer in Denver who'd been filing motion after motion for 3 years and finding each one denied. She knew that Caleb had left the property 18 months ago to handle the legal fight from the Denver end, that his absence had given Edmund the abandonment argument, and that coming back was both necessary and exactly what his uncle had been hoping would happen. If you're here, you're a target, she said. If I'm not here, I lose the property by default. He guided his horse through the gate. There's no clean option. There's only the one that gives us a chance. Us, she said. He glanced at her. You're part of this now. I know I'm not complaining, she said. I'm noting it. She looked up at the house as they approached. Up close, it was even more than it had been from the ridge. Solid and real, and built with a care that spoke of a man who had intended to stay. Your father built this himself? Him and 3 other men. Took 4 summers. Something softened briefly in Caleb's voice. He is to say that anything worth having was worth building slow. Rebecca thought about that. He sounds like a man worth knowing. He was. Short and final and full. She let it be. The housekeeper was named Estelle. She was somewhere north of 60, with white hair pinned so severely it looked architectural, and she was standing in the doorway when they rode up with the expression of a woman who had received no warning and was managing that fact with great professional dignity. Mr. Walker. Her eyes moved to Rebecca with the swift, thorough assessment of someone who had learned people well and trusted the first 3 seconds of impression. Estelle, this is Rebecca, my wife. Something moved across Estelle's face. Surprise, quickly organized into something more composed. Ma'am, she said. Mrs. Walker, Rebecca said, and held out her hand and shook Estelle's firmly. I know this is sudden. I won't pretend otherwise. I imagine you have questions. Estelle looked at her for a moment with those sharp, measuring eyes. Then something in her posture shifted. Not warmth exactly, not yet, but the door opening a crack. I imagine I do, she said. Come in out of the evening air. What happened in the next half hour was a kind of negotiation that happened entirely in the register of practical information and revealed itself as something else entirely only after the fact. Estelle showed Rebecca the kitchen, the larder, the water situation, the wood supply. She explained the household rhythms and the particular way the stove ran hot on the right side, and the cistern needed watching after hard rains. She did all of this in the crisp tone of a woman delivering a briefing, and Rebecca asked direct questions and listened to every answer. By the end of it, Estelle made tea without being asked to. By Rebecca's read, that was as close to approval as the woman was going to offer on a first evening, and she accepted it. It was only later, when Caleb had gone to check the outbuildings, and Rebecca was alone in the kitchen with Estelle, that the older woman set down her cup and said quietly, He's a good man. I want you to know that. Whatever else you're sorting out in your head right now. Rebecca looked at her. Why are you telling me? Because you've got the look of a woman who's been handed more information than she bargained for, and I've known Caleb Walker going on 12 years, and he's the kind of man who earns trust slowly and keeps it permanently. Estelle's eyes were direct and without sentimentality. He doesn't explain himself well, never has. But he is what he says he is. That's rarer than people think. Rebecca was quiet for a moment. He withheld important information from me before we married. I expect he did. You're not going to defend that? No. Estelle picked up her cup again. I'm going to tell you he did it for the only reason he ever does anything. Because he thought it was the right call. He's stubborn about that. Being right doesn't always make it right. She met Rebecca's eyes. You'll have to decide whether the man himself is worth the frustration. I can't make that call for you. Rebecca looked at the cup in her own hands and thought about a man who waited on a trail while she processed rage, who had paid a debt before he asked a single thing in return, who had said, I've been alone a long time, and meant it to be heard. She didn't say anything else. She didn't need to. She found Caleb in the barn an hour after supper. He was with the horses, brushing down his quarter horse with long, methodical strokes. And he didn't stop when she came in, but he turned his head slightly to acknowledge her presence. And she stood in the middle of that space and looked at him and said, I need to ask you something. Go ahead. The man in Harlow Creek, Hargrove's man, does he know where my father lives? Caleb's hand slowed on the brush. He turned fully to face her. Why? Because my father is alone in that cabin, with a clear deed and a daughter who just married into a property dispute, with a man who sounds like he plays rough. And if Hargrove is the kind of man who uses pressure, he won't touch your father. Caleb's voice had gone very quiet. Rebecca, look at me. She was already looking at him. Edmund Hargrove is ruthless, and he is patient, and he will use every legal tool available to him without hesitation. He is not the kind of man who touches civilians. It's not his method. He held her gaze. Your father is safe. She exhaled slowly. You're certain? I'm certain. She nodded, believed him, filed it. All right, she said. Then let's talk about what his method actually is. Because if we're walking into a legal fight, I want to understand the ground. Something crossed Caleb's face that she hadn't seen before. Something that might, in another man, have been called being moved. You want to understand the legal situation, he said. I want to understand everything. She crossed her arms. I am not here to make the house look occupied, Caleb. I told you in that hotel lobby. I'm your wife or I'm nothing. A wife understands what her husband is fighting and why. So explain it to me. He was quiet for a moment. Then he set the brush down and turned to face her fully and began to explain. He talked for a long time. The full history of it. Daniel Hargrove's break from his brother, the building of the Valley property, the silver discovery that Daniel had documented and then deliberately left untouched. The will that had left everything to Caleb with conditions Edmund's lawyers had been picking at ever since. He laid it out in the same plain, unadorned way he did everything, and Rebecca listened to all of it without interrupting. When he finished, she said, The county recorder. The one Edmund tried to bribe. Gerald Marsh. He held. Twice. He's still in office? As of 6 months ago. Then there's a record of the bribery attempt. Caleb looked at her. There's no official record. Marsh refused. He didn't report it. But Marsh knows it happened. And if the right person asked him the right way... She stopped, reorganizing the thought. If this goes to a judge, is there a judge in this district who isn't connected to Hargrove's money? Caleb was very still. You're thinking like a strategist. I'm thinking like a woman who has been managing a survival situation for 4 months with no resources, she said flatly. It's the same skill set. He stared at her for a moment, and then, slowly, starting in his eyes before it reached his mouth, Caleb Walker smiled. It was the first time she had seen it properly, the whole of it, and it rearranged his face entirely, took 10 years off him, made him look like a man who had once laughed easily and was remembering how. It lasted only a moment, but she had seen it, and she could not unsee it, and she was not sure what to do with the warmth that moved through her chest as a result. "There is one judge," he said, "in Denver. Hargrove hasn't got to him yet, as far as I can tell. His name is Alderman Cross." "Can you get a message to him?" "It's not that simple." "Nothing worth doing is." She met his eyes. "Can you get a message to him?" Caleb looked at her for another long moment.
"Maybe," he said. "Then that's where we start." She turned to go, and he said, "Rebecca." She stopped. "I'm sorry," he said, "for what I didn't tell you. I know it doesn't undo it." She stood with her back to him for a moment, deciding. Then she looked back over her shoulder. "You have one apology banked," she said. "Don't waste another one on this. Use the next one for something that actually requires it." She walked back to the house, and behind her, in the barn, she heard the sound that she had been listening for without knowing it. The quiet, steady sound of a man going back to work. The summer dark pressed down over the valley, and somewhere in the mountains beyond, Edmund Hargrove's man was riding back to town. And the clock, the one she hadn't known was running until today, was already counting down. The letter from Edmund Hargrove arrived 9 days after Rebecca did. Caleb brought it in from the postwriter without opening it, set it on the kitchen table, and stood back from it like it was something that might move on its own. Rebecca looked at it. Then she looked at him. "Open it," she said. He did. He read it twice. She could tell by the way his eyes tracked the page a second time, slower. And then he set it down flat on the table and pressed both palms against the wood and stared at the wall. "Caleb." He turned the letter around so she could read it. It was written in the formal, bloodless language of lawyers, but the substance of it was plain enough. Edmund Hargrove, through his attorneys Price and Cole of Denver, was filing an emergency injunction in the Colorado District Court to contest the deed of the Winterhouse Valley property on grounds of inheritance fraud, alleging that Daniel Hargrove's will had been altered without consent and that Caleb James Walker, known also as Caleb Hargrove, had exerted undue influence over his father in the final months of Daniel's life. At the bottom, in a different hand, Edmund's own, she suspected, was a single added line. "A fair settlement is still possible. I suggest you consider it before this becomes uglier than it needs to be." Rebecca read it to the end, then she set it back down. "He's moving," she said. "Faster than I expected." Caleb's voice was flat and controlled, which she had learned meant he was working harder than usual to keep it that way. "If he's filed for an injunction, he's already got a judge in his pocket in the district court. That's what the emergency motion is. He's not expecting to win it. He's expecting to tie up the title in litigation long enough that I can't operate the property, can't sell, can't use it as collateral. He starves us out." "How long does that take?" "A year, maybe 2. He looked at her. "Can be longer if his lawyer is creative." Rebecca sat down at the table. She put her hands flat and thought clearly and deliberately, the way she had learned to think when everything was on fire and panic was a luxury she couldn't afford. "The letter to Judge Cross," she said. "Did you send it?" "6 days ago." "Have you heard back?" "Not yet." "Then we assume we haven't got him yet, and we plan accordingly."
She looked up. What do we have? Documented, verifiable, usable. Caleb pulled out a chair and sat across from her. This, the two of them across a table, problem in the middle, had become their working posture in the 9 days since her arrival, and she had come to understand that it was the arrangement in which he thought best. He didn't think well in circles. He thought well face to face, with something concrete in front of him. The will itself, he said, witnessed by 3 men, 2 of whom are still living. The original survey documentation, all in my father's hand. The deed, recorded twice, once at County and once in Denver. The bribery attempts against Marsh, unrecorded. Marsh is still a witness. His testimony would carry weight. She paused. Has anyone asked him? I haven't. Why not? Caleb was quiet a moment. Because asking him means telling him the situation has escalated. And Marsh is a decent man with a family. I didn't want to put him in the middle of it until I had to. She looked at him steadily. Caleb, we are past that point. He held her gaze, and then he nodded. Once. I'll ride to town tomorrow. We'll ride to town tomorrow. He started to say something. I'm your wife, she said, not your ward. We ride together. He closed his mouth. Tomorrow morning, he said. They were saddled by first light. Estelle handed Rebecca a wrapped parcel of biscuits at the door without comment, met her eyes briefly with that particular expression that had become, over 9 days, its own kind of language, and said, Watch the Eastern Trail. Postrider said there was a rider camping near the ridge 2 nights running. Rebecca looked at her sharply. You didn't mention this before. I'm mentioning it now. Estelle's voice was even. I didn't want to worry Mr. Walker without being certain. I'm certain now. Rebecca turned to Caleb. Hargrove's watching the road, he said. It wasn't a question. Seems likely. She tucked the biscuits in her saddlebag. Does that change our plans? He thought for a moment. No, but it means he'll know we're moving. Good, Rebecca said. Let him know. Caleb looked at her. Something moved in his expression. That thing she had seen before. That thing she still didn't have a comfortable name for. Respect, maybe. Or something just slightly warmer than that. Let's go, he said. Gerald Marsh ran the county recorder's office out of a small building on the main street of Harlow Creek that smelled of old paper and ink and the particular anxiety of bureaucratic responsibility. He was a compact, careful-looking man in his 50s, with the kind of stillness that spoke of a person who had made a deliberate choice, at some point, about who he intended to be, and had kept it. He looked up when they came in, and something shifted in his face when he saw Caleb. Not surprise, more like a man who had been expecting a knock and had decided, when he heard it, whether or not to open the door. He had opened the door. That told Rebecca something. Walker, he said. Marsh. Caleb closed the door behind them. You know why we're here. I expect I do. Marsh looked at Rebecca. My wife, Caleb said. Rebecca. Marsh nodded at her with an assessment that was thorough without being rude. Ma'am. He gestured to the chairs across from his desk. Sit down. They sat. He sat. He laced his fingers on the desk and looked at Caleb and said, He's filed. Injunction. Emergency motion. Price and Cole in Denver. Marsh exhaled through his nose. That's the Hargrove family's firm. Has been for 20 years. He was quiet a moment. I heard it filed 3 days ago through the county circuit. I was going to send word. I'm here now. Caleb leaned forward slightly. Marsh, I need to know if you'll stand as a witness to what Edmund Hargrove offered you 2 years ago. The silence in the room changed texture. Marsh looked at his desk, then at the wall, then at Caleb. That's a significant thing to ask, he said. I know it is. If I testify against Edmund Hargrove, I need to consider what that means for your family, Rebecca said. She said it quietly, not as an interruption, but as a completion. Your position, your safety. Marsh looked at her. I'm not discounting that, she continued. You'd be standing up against a man with deep pockets and a long memory, and I won't pretend that's comfortable. But here's what I know, Mr. Marsh. She held his gaze. You refused him twice. You already made the hard choice. You made it when it was just your own conscience asking. Now, we're asking you to make it count. The room was very quiet. Marsh looked at her for a long moment, then at Caleb, then back at her. Something in his jaw shifted. Your wife, he said to Caleb, with an inflection that wasn't quite a question. Yes, Caleb said. She's right. Marsh unfolded his hands and pressed them flat on the desk and stood up. I'll stand as witness. I'll put it in writing today. What was offered, when, by whom, in what form. Witnessed and notarized. He looked at Caleb directly. But I need something from you. Name it. I need to know this isn't going to blow back and disappear. If I come forward, and then this case falls apart in some backroom deal, I've made a target of myself for nothing. It won't fall apart, Caleb said. You can't promise. I can promise that I will see this to the end. Caleb's voice was very quiet and very final. Whatever it takes. I am not making a deal with Edmund Hargrove. Not today, not in a year, not ever. You have my word. Marsh looked at him for 3 full seconds. All right, he said. Wait here. They had the notarized statement in hand by noon. Writing back, Rebecca kept turning the paper over in her mind. Not its contents, which she'd memorized, but its weight. A man's courage pressed flat between 2 pages. She thought about the kind of world where doing the right thing required this much deliberate bravery, and she felt the particular anger she always felt at that world. And then she set it aside, because anger was only useful when there was something immediate to do with it. That's one piece, Caleb said. He was watching the ridge to the east. One piece is more than we had yesterday. He was quiet for a moment. I want to ride to Denver. She looked at him. When? This week. The injunction moves to a hearing. I'd give it 2 weeks. We need to be in front of Judge Cross before it does. He paused. If Cross is what I think he is, and if we can get Marsh's statement in front of him before Price and Cole have the courtroom already sewn up, then we change the ground before the fight starts, Rebecca finished. Yes. She thought about it. Denver was 3 days hard riding. 3 days there, however long the meeting with Cross required. 3 days back. A week minimum, possibly more. Estelle can manage the property, she said. It's not the property I'm thinking about. She looked at him. If Hargrove's men are watching the road, he said carefully, and they see us both leave, then they know the house is empty and move on it? She nodded. One of us stays. The trail ran along a ridge, and the summer wind came up strong for a moment, and Rebecca's horse tossed her head and settled, and Rebecca thought about what she was about to say before she said it. I'll stay, she said. You go to Denver. Caleb shook his head. I'm not leaving you here alone with... Estella's here, and I am not alone in any sense that matters. She kept her voice even. You're the one with a relationship with Cross. You're the one who knows the full legal picture. You need to make that ride. She paused. I need to hold this house. He looked at her with an expression she was still learning to read, the one that lived between argument and something that wasn't argument. You'd be the only thing standing between Hargrove's men and this property, he said. Yes. If Denton decides to push, then I push back. She met his eyes. "I've been managing threats with no resources for the better part of a year, Caleb. Don't underestimate what I do with something real behind me." He was quiet for a long stretch of trail. Then, "I leave in 2 days. I want to make sure you know the full layout of the property before I go. Every exit, every resource, every neighbor within driving distance." "Agreed. And if anything moves, if Denton comes, if anyone comes, you send for Holt at the North Pasture. He's been with this property 12 years, and he can handle himself." "Understood." He looked at her one more time, and she held his gaze, and neither of them looked away first. They just reached the bottom of the ridge together, and the trail flattened out, and there was simply forward. The way there had always only been forward. He left on a Thursday morning before the sun was properly up. He had spent 2 days doing exactly what he'd said, walking her through the property, the people, the contingencies. He'd introduced her to Holt, a weathered man of few words, who had appraised her in 30 seconds and apparently found her adequate, which Rebecca had decided to take as a compliment. He'd shown her where the documents were kept, every deed and survey and correspondence locked in the iron box under the floorboards in his father's study. He'd shown her how to reach the county sheriff, a man named Briggs, who had no love for the Hargroves and might be persuadable in a crisis. On his last evening, they sat at the kitchen table long after Estelle had gone to bed, and they talked. Not about strategy, not about the legal fight, but about his father. About the 4 summers it had taken to build the house. About the kind of man Daniel Hargrove had been, stubborn and visionary, and possessed of a deep, quiet conviction that the land was not a thing to be extracted, but a thing to be kept. About how Caleb had learned most of what he knew, about horses and timber and winter survival, and what it meant to stay somewhere and mean it. From a man who had chosen the high country over everything easier that had been available to him. Rebecca listened to all of it and understood that she was being trusted with something. That Caleb Walker did not talk about his father to just anyone, and that the talking of it was its own kind of statement about where they stood. When it was late and the fire had burned low, she said, "Your father would have been pleased with what you've built here." Caleb was quiet for a moment. "I hope so." He would have. She was certain of it, in the way she was sometimes certain of things she couldn't fully explain. A man who builds a place and then chooses the right person to give it to? He thought about who you were. He knew. Caleb turned his cup in his hands and looked at the fire. "Get to Denver," she said. "Get to Cross. Come back." He turned and looked at her, and in the firelight his face was open in a way she hadn't seen before. The careful stillness of him momentarily set aside. "I'll come back," he said. "I know you will." She stood up from the table. "I'll be here." She went to bed, and she heard him sit a while longer by the fire. And she lay in the dark and thought about the strange mathematics of trust, how it built itself out of small, repeated moments, until the structure of it was stronger than you'd expected, and how you only understood its full weight when you tested it against something real. Morning came, and he saddled his horse and loaded his pack and stood in the yard, and she handed him the canteen, and their hands crossed for a moment over it. "Be careful," she said. "You too." He held her gaze 1 beat past necessary. Then he mounted and rode. 3 days passed quietly. Too quietly. Rebecca noticed it on the 2nd day. The absence of Denton on the trail. The absence of any watching presence on the ridge. The stillness that wasn't peace, but something performing the shape of peace. On the 4th day, Estelle came in from the yard with a face that told the story before her mouth did. "Ryder," she said. "Coming in from the East Road. Not alone." Rebecca was at the iron box before Estelle finished the sentence. She had the document folder in her hands. Deeds, surveys, the original will, Marcia's notarized statement, when she heard the horses in the yard. 4 of them by the sound. She heard a voice she recognized. Denton. And underneath his voice, another, older, more measured, with the particular cadence of a man accustomed to rooms that went quiet when he entered. She tucked the folder inside her dress, smoothed the front of her apron, and walked to the front door and opened it. The man on the horse in the center of the yard was Edmund Hargrove. She knew him without being told. He was 60, perhaps, silver-haired, broad-shouldered, with Caleb's gray eyes, but none of Caleb's stillness in them. His eyes moved and calculated and recorded, and when they landed on her, they did all 3 things simultaneously. "Mrs. Walker," he said. His voice was warm, which was worse than if it had been cold. Rebecca stood in the doorway with her hands quiet at her sides and looked at him without moving. "Mr. Hargrove," she said, "my husband isn't here." "I know," he smiled. It was an excellent smile. "I came to speak with you." Behind her, she could feel the solid weight of the house at her back. 31 years of it, built slow by a man who had meant to stay. She thought about Daniel Hargrove, choosing the high country over everything easier. She thought about the folder pressed against her ribs. She thought about Caleb's voice saying, "I'll come back." "Then you'd better come in," she said. And she stepped back from the door, and she let him come. Edmund Hargrove did not look like a villain. That was the first thing Rebecca registered as she led him into the front room. He looked like someone's grandfather, silver-haired, measured, with the kind of easy authority that came from decades of being the most powerful man in every room he entered. He took off his hat when he came inside, which was either genuine courtesy or the performance of it, and he looked around the room with an expression that managed to be both appreciative and possessive simultaneously. "Beautiful house," he said. "My brother built well." "He did," Rebecca agreed. She did not offer him a seat. She stood in the center of the room with her hands at her sides and waited. He sat anyway, in the chair nearest the window, crossing one leg over the other with the comfort of a man who had decided the space was already his. Denton stayed at the door. The other 2 men remained outside. Rebecca noted all of it. "I'll be direct," Hargrove said. "I appreciate directness in people. It saves time." "Then be direct," she said. He looked at her with those calculating gray eyes. Caleb's eyes, but wrong, like a familiar song played in the wrong key. "Your husband has put you in a difficult position, Mrs. Walker. I want you to understand that my quarrel is not with you. You came into this situation without full information. I think we both know that." Rebecca kept her face still. "What is it you've come to offer, Mr. Hargrove?" His mouth curved slightly. "Practical woman. Good." He uncrossed his legs and leaned forward with his elbows on his knees. "I'm prepared to settle this property dispute today. No courts, no injunctions, no years of legal uncertainty. I'll honor whatever arrangement Caleb made with you personally. Your security is not in question. I simply want what my brother should have left to the family, not handed off to a son who walked away from the Hargrove name." "This property was left to Caleb by his father," Rebecca said, "legally and completely. The legality is exactly what's in question." He said it pleasantly, like a man correcting a small mistake. "A will signed under duress. A son who isolated a sick old man in his final months." "That's a lie," Rebecca said. The pleasantness in his face didn't disappear. It just moved somewhere colder underneath the surface. "Those are serious words, Mrs. Walker." "Yes." She held his gaze. "They are." Denton shifted at the door. Hargrove raised one hand without looking back, and Denton went still. "You're a young woman," Hargrove said, and his voice had changed, not threatening, but different. The warmth of it filed down to something more precise. "You married Caleb Walker 9 days ago. You don't know him. You don't know this family.
You don't know what you're standing in the middle of. I know more than you think, she said.
Enough to gamble your future on it?
I'm not gambling, she said it quietly. I'm standing in my own house.
Something moved across Edmund Hargrove's face. The first genuine reaction she'd seen from him. A flash of something that wasn't calculation. She thought it might have been surprise. She thought, with a cold clarity, that he had come here expecting a frightened woman alone in a house, and he had gotten something else entirely. And he was recalibrating. She pressed the advantage before he finished recalibrating. My husband is in Denver, she said. I expect you already know that. I expect that's why you chose today to make this visit. She watched his face. What you don't know is what he's doing there. Hargrove was very still. He's meeting with Judge Alderman Cross, she said, with documentation that includes a notarized statement from Gerald Marsh detailing 2 separate bribery attempts made on your behalf against a county official. She kept her voice even and her eyes on his. The same documentation includes your father's original survey of the silver deposits, which, as you know, Daniel Hargrove chose not to mine, and specifically notated in his estate records as a resource to be preserved. Which means any attempt to mine that silver would require contesting not just the inheritance, but your own brother's explicit recorded wishes. She paused. That's a harder case to make in front of an honest judge. The room was absolutely silent. Denton was staring at her from the doorway. Edmund Hargrove looked at her for a long, unreadable moment. Then he did something she hadn't expected. He laughed. Short, genuine, and almost appreciative. He found himself something remarkable, Hargrove said, more to himself than to her.
He found himself a wife, Rebecca said. Are we finished, Mr. Hargrove? He stood. He was still smiling, but the smile had changed into something more honest and therefore more dangerous. He picked up his hat and turned it in his hands. This isn't finished, he said. I want you to understand that. I respect what you've done here today. I genuinely do. But a notarized statement from a county recorder and a meeting with a district judge don't end the legal fight of this size. This goes on. I know it does, Rebecca said. We'll be ready. He looked at her one more time. Something in the look acknowledged what she was, not dismissing it, not diminishing it, just cataloging it, the way he cataloged everything. Good day, Mrs. Walker, he said. Good day, Mr. Hargrove. He walked out. Denton followed. She stood in the front room and listened to the horses leave the yard. And when the sound had fully faded, she sat down in the nearest chair and put her face in her hands, and took 3 long, slow breaths. Estelle appeared in the kitchen doorway. Well, the older woman said. Well, Rebecca agreed, into her palms. You held him. Rebecca lifted her face. I held him today. She straightened. He'll come back harder. Then we'd better make sure your husband gets back first. Estelle crossed her arms. You did well, girl. Rebecca stood up. The folder was still pressed against her ribs. Every document intact. Never produced, never shown. The entire conversation had run on the threat of what she held, rather than its display. And Edmund Hargrove was sharp enough to know it. And that was precisely why it had worked. She had gambled that he wouldn't call a bluff she wasn't making. She had been right. But Estelle was right too. Today was one move. The board was still in play. Caleb came back on the 6th day. He rode in late afternoon, faster than he'd left, and Rebecca was in the yard when she heard the horse, and she knew the pace of it before she could see him. That particular urgency in the hoofbeats that said something had happened, whether good or bad, She couldn't yet tell. He pulled up in the yard and dismounted in one motion and looked at her and said, "Cross agreed to a pre-hearing review. Private chambers, week after next. If we can get Marsh there in person—" He stopped. He read her face. "What happened?"
"Edmund was here," she said. "4 days ago."
Every line of him went still.
"Are you—" "I'm fine. Estelle's fine. The house is fine."
She met his eyes.
"I held him."
He stared at her. "You held Edmund Hargrove?"
"I told him about Cross, about Marsh's statement, about the silver survey documentation." She crossed her arms. "I didn't show him anything. I told him what we had. He left."
Caleb stood in the yard, looking at her with an expression that was entirely unguarded for the first time since she'd known him. Stripped of all the careful stillness, just a man looking at a woman who had done something he hadn't believed was possible, and understanding for the first time the full shape of who he'd married. "Rebecca," he said.
"You need to write to Marsh tonight," she said. "He needs to come to Denver for the Cross review. That's the piece we still need."
"Rebecca."
"And we should send word to the 2 living witnesses on your father's will. If Cross is willing to look at this properly, we should have every—"
"Rebecca." He crossed the yard in 4 steps and took both her hands and held them. And the directness of it stopped her mid-sentence. "Thank you," he said. She looked at their hands. His were warm and slightly rough and completely steady.
"Don't thank me," she said, though her voice had lost some of its briskness. "It's my house, too."
Something broke open in his expression at that. Not dramatically, not with the operatic weight of a man having a revelation, but quietly, the way a window opens to let in air that has been needed for a long time.
"Yes," he said. "It is."
She looked up at him. This close, in the afternoon light, she could see the tiredness of 6 days' hard riding in his face. And underneath the tiredness, something that had not been there before. A tension released, a weight set down. The particular easing of a man who had come home to find the thing he valued most still standing. She did not pull her hands away.
"Come inside," she said. "Eat something. Then we plan."
The letter from Judge Alderman Cross arrived 2 days before the Denver review, and it was not what either of them had anticipated. Caleb read it standing at the kitchen table, and his face did the thing it did when information was reorganizing itself into a new configuration. Rebecca waited. "Hargrove's lawyer filed a counter-motion," he said. "Challenging the review?" "Challenging the witness." He looked up. "They've filed a character complaint against Marsh, claiming he falsified county records in an unrelated case 4 years ago." He set the letter down. "If it sticks, his testimony is inadmissible. And without Marsh—" "It's just documentation against documentation," Rebecca finished. "And Hargrove's lawyers are better funded." "Yes." She sat down. She thought hard and fast. "Is the character complaint legitimate?" she said. "Did Marsh actually falsify anything?" "I don't know." "Then we find out." She stood back up. "Before we go to Denver, we find out. Because if there's something there, we need to know it before Cross does. And if there's nothing there, if it's fabricated, then fabricating a character complaint against a witness is itself a crime." Caleb was already reaching for his coat. "I'll ride to Marsh today," he said. "We'll ride to Marsh today," she said. He looked at her. He did not argue. Gerald Marsh went pale when Caleb put the counter-motion on his desk. Then he went something more complicated than pale. He went the color of a man sorting through his own history for the specific thing that's being used against him. And Rebecca watched his face and knew before he spoke. 4 years ago, Marsh said slowly. The Dunmore land transfer. Caleb leaned forward. What happened? Nothing criminal. Marsh's voice was careful. But there was an error. A filing error on my part. The transfer date was recorded incorrectly. It was corrected within the week, fully documented, no harm done. But the original filing exists. He looked up. If someone wanted to call it a falsification rather than a correction, they could make an argument, Rebecca said. A thin argument, Marsh said. Thin arguments are enough to create doubt, Caleb said. And doubt is enough to make Cross hesitant about relying on your testimony. The three of them sat in the heavy quiet of that assessment. It was Rebecca who spoke first. Where is the correction documentation? Marsh blinked. Here, in the files. Then we bring it. She looked at both of them. We bring the original filing and the correction and the full timeline, and we walk into that review room and we show Cross exactly what the error was and exactly how it was handled, and we let him decide whether that's the conduct of a man committing fraud or the conduct of a man who made a mistake and fixed it. She paused. Because there is a material difference between those two things, and an honest judge will see it. Marsh looked at her for a long moment. You're asking me to walk into a room with Hargrove's lawyers, he said, and stake my professional reputation on the hope that the judge in that room is actually honest. Yes, she said, that's exactly what I'm asking. That's a significant thing to ask. I know it. She held his gaze. You refused Edmund Hargrove twice when it cost you nothing but your conscience. I'm asking you to do it one more time when it costs you something real. She let that sit a moment. I'm not going to tell you it's without risk, but I will tell you that Caleb Walker is not going to make a backroom deal with his uncle. I will tell you that if we lose this property through honest process, we accept it. But I will not let us lose it through manufactured lies while honest evidence sits in a file drawer. Marsh pressed both hands flat on his desk, looked at the wall, looked back at her. I'll be in Denver Tuesday morning, he said. The review in Judge Cross's chambers lasted 4 hours. Rebecca sat outside the door for all of it, with her hands in her lap and her back straight, and her mind cycling through every variable she could name, and some she couldn't. And Estelle, who had insisted on making the Denver trip on grounds that someone sensible needed to be present, sat beside her with a thermos of coffee and said nothing, which was the most useful thing anyone had ever done for Rebecca in a courtroom hallway. When Caleb came out, his face told her nothing for one terrible second. Then he sat down beside her and said quietly, Cross is issuing a stay on the injunction. She closed her eyes. He's not ruling on the full case yet. That'll take months. But the stay means the property can't be seized or transferred while the case is active. He paused. And he's referred the bribery allegations and the Marsh character complaint to the state attorney's office for independent review. She opened her eyes. The character complaint, Cross called it what it was, Caleb said. In those words, in front of Price and Cole. Something moved in his voice. He called it retaliatory fabrication. On the record. The hallway was very quiet. That's not the end, Rebecca said. No, it's not. He turned and looked at her directly. But it's not the beginning either. We are no longer behind. We are level, with ground under our feet and documentation in hand and a judge who is paying attention. He paused. We have a chance, a real one. She thought about a morning in a foothills cabin, pressing a debt notice flat with her palm. She thought about a pen and a signature, and a man she hadn't known standing at a respectful distance and letting his hand fall when she didn't take it. She thought about a trail going up into the mountains, and a valley opening out below a ridge, and the word nothing
said without salesmanship.
She thought about 4 days alone in that house with Edmund Hargrove's eyes cataloging everything she was, and the folder against her ribs, and the quiet, solid weight of knowing what she was protecting and why. "Then we keep going," she said. They rode back to the valley 3 days later. The summer was moving toward its peak. The air thin and bright and clean the way it only was at that altitude, with the light falling long across the mountain grass, and the creek running full and cold. Rebecca rode beside Caleb on the last stretch of trail, and when they came over the final ridge and the valley opened below them, she felt the same catch in her chest she'd felt the first time. She thought it would always do that. She had decided to let it. "Estelle's going to be insufferable about the Denver trip," Caleb said. "She's earned it," Rebecca almost smiled. "She was right about bringing the coffee." He looked at her sideways. "You didn't drink any of it." "It was the principle." She paused. "Caleb, when this is fully resolved, when Cross rules and the case is closed, what does this place become?" She looked at the valley below. "I mean, what do you want it to become? Not what you're defending, what you're building." He was quiet for a long moment, the way he was quiet when he was giving a question its actual weight. "My father built it to be kept," he said. "Not to produce wealth. To be a place where something true could happen." He looked at her. "I always thought that was an old man's romanticism. I'm not sure I think so anymore." She looked at him. "What changed your mind?" He held her gaze. "You told me it was your house too," he said simply. "And you meant it. And somewhere between that moment and this one, it started to feel like what my father was trying to build when he came up here. Something real between two people. Not a contract." Rebecca looked down at the valley, at the house that had held against Edmund Hargrove's pressure, at the land her father-in-law had chosen over everything easier, at the future that was not settled or secured, but was theirs to fight for. "It is real," she said. "That's not romanticism. That's just what it is." He nodded once. They rode down together into the valley, into the light and the summer and the long work ahead. And Rebecca Hartley Walker understood with complete and unsentimentally clarity that she had not simply survived the transaction she had agreed to in a hotel lobby in Harlow Creek. She had found something that most people spent their whole lives looking for and never holding in their hands. She had signed her name to a stranger and ridden into the mountains, and the mountains had given her back herself. That was the whole of it. That was enough. That was everything.